Hi, welcome back to Bush History. I'm David Busch. Today's topic is going to be what I call the conservative ascendancy, the period of 1981 to 1993, in which we had Ronald Reagan as president for 8 years and George Bush as vice president, following him for an additional 4 years. Now, Ronald Reagan is one of those characters in American history. He had a wonderful, wonderful personality. He had been an actor. He used to act in what we call spaghetti westerns back in the 1950s. Spaghetti westerns are westerns that were made in Europe, specifically in Italy, where it was a little less expensive and it was a little quicker in terms of getting things done without going through some of the Hollywood stuff. Anyway, he later on became head of the Actors Union and governor of California following that, and then certainly he won the presidency in 1980 following the troubled Carter administration. Now, one of the things that we have to take a look at is why presidents become presidents sometimes. In my previous video, I talked about that Jimmy Carter had become president because of what was looked at as the kind of lackluster Gerald Ford administration, and Gerald Ford became president because Richard Nixon gave him the job, and Richard Nixon became president because he was a law and order guy following all of the protests of the Johnson era. So there's always a reason why one president occurs after another. And the other thing to consider is very often you have a change in political parties and political focus. A Republican generally follows a Democrat generally follows a Republican. It is unusual in modern politics to have a Republican administration following a Republican administration in a conventional election, although that's exactly what happens with Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Nevertheless, Jimmy Carter was looked at as a kind of a weak president, and Ronald Reagan, he was going to set things straight. He was John Wayne to come into town, and he was going to make America strong again. And we're going to take a look at the Reagan administration right now. So we have Ronald Reagan over here on my right and your left, followed by George Bush. So we call this era the Reagan-Bush era. This PowerPoint and some other note sets are available on www.bushhistory.net. Topic 28, the Reagan era. I am working to get finished in time for the AP exam to leave some time for review, and I think that will probably happen. But nevertheless, take a look at this. It will help in understanding what it was like to be alive under President Reagan. I was certainly around when President Reagan was around, and it was an interesting time period. President Reagan is adored by some and vilified by others. He is adored by a moderate conservative wing of the Republican Party. He is probably too liberal to fit into the Republican Party circa 2014, who has swung very conservative. And liberal Democrats think it's a bunch of smoke and mirrors, that he was a terrible president. So I'll leave it for you to judge. Let's just go through facts. So we call this time period the Reagan Revolution. The Reagan Revolution. Following the stagflation of Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan was going to make things better. He was going to clean up the United States. He was an idealist. He was very patriotic. He thought the USSR, our enemy at the time, was the evil empire, and he was going to clean up government. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem, Ronald Reagan said. I notice I have a typo here. I've got to correct, but that's still the quote. And there's a link down here to a bit of Ronald Reagan on YouTube. In either case, he was everybody's grandfather. People liked Ronald Reagan. Even his political opponents liked Ronald Reagan. They thought that he was a kind man, and he was a kind man. And if you agreed with him, you thought he was wonderful. And obviously he was re-elected, so the nation, at least the voters, thought he was wonderful for a time period. And then we walked into George Bush following him, so they wanted that aura, if you like, to continue. If you take a look at the economy under Ronald Reagan, the Keynesian theory of government, since JFK had led to stagflation, that was, John Maynard Keynes thought we could use deficit spending. That if the government spent money, it would have a ripple effect. It would create jobs, and those people making money in their jobs would pay taxes going back into the government, and would have a multiplier effect. That was John Maynard Keynes' theory. In either case, Reagan cut taxes in astronomical amounts. He cut taxes way back down, and strangely enough, by cutting taxes, that means tax rate, tax incomes doubled for the United States government. In other words, the government made some money off of this because by cutting corporate taxes, corporations hired more workers. That was the theory behind all of this, called Reaganomics. He cut domestic spending, he cracked down on unions, he broke the PATCO strike, Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization. They felt, the air traffic controllers felt, that they were overworked. The strike had less to do with money and more to do with manpower. And Ronald Reagan sort of said, if you guys go on strike, I'm going to fire you. And sure enough, they went on strike, and sure enough, he fired every air traffic controller that was on strike. And he replaced them with military air traffic controllers. A period of retraining occurred for new air traffic controllers, and once again, we had air traffic controllers in the towers again, who were private contractors or private employees, and we had our air traffic controllers back. But he broke PATCO. In either case, did a lot of deregulation of business, and he raised interest rates. Very unusual thing for a Republican president. He raised interest rates to help combat inflation. It's a little dicey to say how well that actually worked, but take a look what happens here. Tax revenues are increasing. In other words, the amount being paid into the government is increasing. Now, you would think if the tax revenues are increasing, the economy would be doing wonderful. Well, let's take more of a look. He also wanted to increase the American military might. There had been a build down. A build down means that there was less money on military. There had been a build down following the Vietnam War. The public did not have much of a taste for increasing the size of the military. As a result of the Iran hostage crisis and what looked like a kind of weak, demoralized nation, Ronald Reagan wanted to change that. So he wants to increase military spending. He wanted to overpower the Soviet Union by outspending them. This is us, this is everything we can build. The whole guns and butter discussion. Generally speaking, a nation can have guns or butter. The United States, he felt, was able to have both. Now I want you to think about this for a second. If he is cutting taxes and he's increasing military spending, there has to be a way to make that work, or you're going to end up in a tremendous hole at the end of all of it. He proposed something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was dubbed Star Wars. And the Strategic Defense Initiative, it was kind of an interesting idea because it was completely out of Ronald Reagan's imagination. He felt that if the world is a circle, that we could ring the world with these satellites. And these satellites would have lasers, and the lasers would shoot down any incoming Soviet missiles. Well, the funny thing about this was, he didn't speak to anybody before he came up with the idea and made the speech. He didn't see whether it was provable or not. He just came out and said it. And by coming out and saying it, two things occurred. First of all, it caused a tremendous increase in military research, in R&D, research and development in this, and it also caused the Soviet Union to go, wow, that's going to be terrible because they're going to be able to stop any missiles. And there goes the whole idea that we have a leg up on the United States. And it caused the Soviet Union to think about whether they could actually spend money to stay with us. It was criticized by a lot of Americans. I do remember occasionally they would show a test of this on television in the mid-1980s, and they couldn't guarantee its success. Even as the greatest engineers and the greatest scientists in the United States worked on this, they couldn't guarantee its success. And think about it, if 1 or 2 missiles gets through and destroys an American city, it really didn't work that well. But nevertheless, it caused the Soviet Union to pause and take a breath. And maybe that was its real intent, because even today, we don't have anything that works like this to my knowledge. Gennady Gerasimov, the former top spokesman of the Soviet Union ministry, the Soviet foreign minister, ruefully acknowledged, Reagan bolstered the US military might to ruin the Soviet economy. And it worked. Now we have what's called recession and growth under Ronald Reagan. To control inflation, he raised the federal overnight funds rate as high as 21%. The overnight funds rate is what the Federal Reserve will lend to banks to cover loans, outstanding loans, and demand deposits, meaning savings accounts. So if the banks lent too much money, they would borrow from the Federal Reserve, and the overnight rate was 21%, very, very high, and it was, the whole idea was to discourage banks from lending money. The economy underwent a harsh shrinkage. Now, a shrinkage in the economy is measured two ways: a declining gross domestic product, and linked to a declining gross domestic product is a lowering of jobs, meaning higher unemployment. So more people were going to start to lose their jobs as a result of this. Following this, the economy underwent record growth. So it's kind of like a decline and an increase. 13 million new jobs were created from 1981 to 1986, but at the same time, because of those lower taxes, the national debt increased. And increasing debt in a Republican administration is not what Republicans are all about. They want to decrease debt, but he cut taxes. You can't increase spending and cut taxes and not think that you're not going to have more debt. Reagan's foreign policy, quote, "America is the strongest, greatest, most righteous country in the world," and he was out to prove it. He believed in peace through strength. He was going to build the military up. He was going to have all of these military exercises and show the world, this is who we are. After 10 years, you have the debacle at the end of the Vietnam War, where you have the helicopter on the roof of the American embassy. You have the problems that occurred during the Iranian hostage crisis when Jimmy Carter was unwilling to send the military to rescue the hostages. He wanted to show that America was back. As a matter of fact, his campaign slogan at the beginning of his second term, when he's running for president again, was, "It's morning in America." He wanted to show that we were strong and that we were powerful. He put new missiles in the Midwest, new missiles in Europe, and he had new B-1 bombers built. So now we have more planes and more missiles. Communism, he said, was destined for the ash heap of history. He was great for these sound bites. These sound bites, small quotes, and spin doctors. Spin doctors were administrative spokespeople who would take anything Ronald Reagan did and they would spin it in such a way that it looked like it was the right thing to do. They would handle him. And he was a former actor, and he was used to being handled, and it worked for him. He went to Nicaragua, and in something called the Iran-Contra affair, he okayed the use of funds in Nicaragua to stop a communist leadership from developing a lot of power in Nicaragua. He supported what's called the Sandinistas, and he was once again showing that America was not going to sit still for the spread of communism. Timing is everything in history, and in this case, timing meant Mikhail Gorbachev. In the early 1980s, Leonid Brezhnev, who'd been the longtime leader of the Soviet Union, died. And the Soviets, we always knew this, by the way, when they played classical music on TV in the Soviet Union, you knew something bad had happened. So Leonid Brezhnev dies, and he is replaced by someone named Konstantin Chernenko, another old guy from the Russian Revolution. Chernenko lasted, I believe, about a year. And then they replaced him with another person, Yuri Andropov. Well, you know what happened here. But what's funny was when Andropov died, the New York Post printed a headline. New York Post is famous for its flamboyant headline. And the headline was, "Andropov drops off." And now they were without another leader in the Soviet Union. So this time they picked someone younger. And they picked Mikhail Gorbachev to be head of the Communist Party and premier of the Soviet Union. So we have Mikhail Gorbachev coming to power. He is appointed General Secretary, the first Soviet leader who did not live through the Russian Revolution. But let's face it, they were getting older and older. They needed some new blood. He enacted a policy of glasnost, political openness. People now were able to speak out. And he adopted another policy called perestroika. Perestroika was a private ownership of a certain level of business in the Soviet Union. So now, in a country that had been dominated by this command economy, the West called them communists. Communists, not true. The West called them Soviets. Soviets, not true. What they really were was a command economy with a dictatorship. They told them what to do. The dictatorship told the machine, the manufacturing machine in the Soviet Union what to do. So it was a command economy. It wasn't communism, because communism doesn't really have a government. It wasn't really socialism, because in socialism there is an element of private ownership. It was a command economy. So nevertheless, perestroika now is going to allow for private ownership in this nation where there had been none. And this is going to be a wonderful thing. There's going to be a golden age, like a supernova at the end of the Soviet Union, when Gorbachev is in power, and then it's going to die out when the Soviet Union dies out. So Reagan was strong and tough talking. Now let's take a look at what happens inside the United States, domestically. There's also a note set available on the Reagan era in the folder in Bush history. I'd like to share some of those notes with you right now. So I'm going to cue them up, and I'll be right with you. Ronald Reagan's domestic economic program was dubbed Reaganomics. And it was something that had been tried in the past when Herbert Hoover was president. Granted, the economic times were different, but it was a similar idea. It was called trickle-down economics as well. And you'll see why as we take a look at this. So Reaganomics, Reagan wanted to reform the economy by cutting tax to corporations and the wealthy, allowing them to invest in business, thereby stimulating the economy, which I talked about earlier. It did occur to a point, but it was very unequal. This was based heavily on the theory of supply-side economics. As opposed to John Maynard Keynes, he went with George Gilder's ideas in War and Wealth and Poverty. A successful economy depends on the proliferation of the rich. In other words, you take the people who are wealthiest, you give them the most benefits, and they will improve the economy. And that may indeed happen, but it doesn't happen for everyone. If successful, prosperity will trickle down from the top to those at lower levels of the economy. Along with this theory, it was necessary to deregulate a lot of businesses. Jimmy Carter had started deregulation, and Ronald Reagan is continuing en masse, taking away many, many regulations from the larger industries in the countries. Now, if you think about what that really means, if you deregulate the automobile industry, because this is one of the industries that he believed in deregulation, where do you think they are going to try to increase their profits and cut their costs? Well, one of the things had to do with safety. When Reagan became president, cars had bumpers that could withstand a 5-mile-an-hour impact. They were made of metal, or they had plastic over metal, but they were supposed to withstand a 5-mile-an-hour impact. Ronald Reagan thought that that was too much government regulation, that people could research the cars, and the cars that could withstand impacts would be the ones they'd buy. Well, what happened was, by doing away with the 5-mile-an-hour bumpers, we then had a piece of plastic on car bumpers, and just a little piece of metal behind it, and these car bumpers were getting damaged all the time. We're talking about parking lot things. You know, one bumper hitting another bumper, and they should be able to withstand it, but they weren't anymore. That's an example of deregulation, or deregulating the airline industries. Instead of setting certain rates for certain routes, which had been done in the past, the airlines would openly compete. It was more of an open capitalism. But what happened was, airlines started to go out of business as people with deeper pockets could cut their prices more. So that's what we're talking about in terms of deregulation. And when these companies, when airlines went out of business, it would cause a lot of people to lose their jobs. His tax program was a great benefit to the upper class. He cut their tax rate from a high of 70% to a 28% tax rate. Now, taxes had been higher, much higher, through most of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, through most of the younger part of the baby boomers. And the economy did well during the 1950s and 60s. It started to falter in the 1970s, but nevertheless, it was called the Economic Recovery Act of 1981. He said, you know, there's too much funding of government programs, so he wants to go after the EPA and OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. He wants to back up on their funding. So what happens there is the EPA has to back up on some of its regulations in terms of standards for cars and fuel economy and inspections of factories and the like. OSHA has to back up on some of its inspections on the safety of the workplace. And you can see why the people who are the average worker in the United States are going to suffer more than the business owner. While cutting tax, a huge increase in defense spending caused the deficit to skyrocket. Take a look at this. In 1980, the deficit was $60 billion. By 1986, it was $221 billion. The national debt rose from $914 billion in 1980 to $3.1 trillion in 1990. This left an enormous debt for future generations to pay. I remember what this was like. I was teaching in the 1980s, and there was a lot of money being spent because the theory was if the federal government could borrow money and spend it, so could we. I remember seeing students of mine driving to school in brand new cars where the parents had leased cars for students. Now, leasing isn't a bad idea. Leasing for students is a terrible idea, though. So there was a lot of money being spent without worrying about paying it back. It's kind of like having a credit card, and you keep spending and spending and spending and spending. Well, as you keep spending and spending and spending, the people you're spending the money on love you. Well, that's what was happening during the Reagan administration. As the federal government was building up the defense industries in the United States, they loved him. They thought he was wonderful. He was building up the military, and the military loved him. They thought he was wonderful. So when it came time to re-elect him in 1984, he was re-elected largely by people who benefited from his programs. But education suffered with cuts in education. The environment suffered. The workplace suffered. People who had AIDS suffered because there was a lot of money being cut in those areas. The Reagan problems created during, the economic problems, created during the Reagan presidency are going to impact on George Bush's presidency because George Bush is going to have to pay back this money. Social programs in opposition to the New Deal and Great Society philosophy. By the way, Ronald Reagan was a real FDR fan. Reagan cut back on many social programs. He reduced federal spending on social programs by $136 billion between 1982 and 1984. Cuts occurred in public service jobs, unemployment payments, welfare, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, education, the environment, alternative fuel research, the arts, and urban housing programs, all social programs. He thought this was up to the states to pay these things and not the federal government. The 1970s regulation for increasing fuel efficiency and reducing pollution for cars, they were largely eliminated when the cuts for the EPA went into place. Federal grants for college were also cut, forcing an increase in student loan debt. It used to be that there were many more federal grants for education than there are even today. So this huge student loan debt goes back to the debt the United States government was incurring during the 1980s that we never really got out of. We cut the deficit, but we never got out of the debt. So many federal regulatory agencies are weakened or eliminated while he was president. So yes, some people did very well and some people not so well. Other domestic issues that occurred while he was president and while George Bush was president, there was a deregulation of what we call savings and loans. Banks have a specific definition. Savings and loans were an alternative to banks, and they were in smaller neighborhoods and smaller communities, and they made loans to people who were buying homes and to small real estate developments, not mega commercial developments. Well, they were deregulated. When they were deregulated, they started to make risky investments, kind of like the recent problems in the 2000s when banks were making risky investments. Savings and loans were making risky investments to people who couldn't pay back these loans. And that led to the federal government having to bail out these smaller savings and loans. You can call them savings banks if you like. Reagan wanted to give more responsibility to local government, and his plan was called the New Federalism. Federalism is, remember, the division of power between federal, state, and local governments. Well, he wanted the states to pick up more of the responsibility, and that simply meant that there was going to be less aid given to the states, and the states would have to come up with their own funding stream for any programs they wanted to institute or help grow or help expand. Between Reagan and Bush, they appointed 5 new Supreme Court justices. Significant among them was Sandra Day O'Connor. You have a Republican nominating the first woman Supreme Court justice. So Ronald Reagan, he wasn't an ultra-conservative. He was a conservative for sure. He believed in many Republican philosophies, but he wasn't an extremist. The Republican Party in 2014 is very extremely conservative. Ronald Reagan probably wouldn't make it in today's Republican Party. He'd be considered too liberal. George Bush appointed 2 Supreme Court judges as well. Ronald Reagan was against Roe versus Wade, and it was feared that his judges would overturn Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade has not been overturned. However, there have been more and more regulations and restrictions put on what can be done with a woman's right to choose whether to have an abortion or not. Poverty rose during the 1980s. By the end of the 1980s, wealth was more unevenly distributed than at any time since 1945. 20% of U.S. children lived in poverty by the end of the 1980s. That's 1 in 5. So this idea that the economy grew and exploded into great during the 1980s is a fallacy. These numbers are available at the CBO, at the Congressional Budget Office. You can check this out. Some people did very well. A lot of people didn't. George Bush ran on a platform of continuing Reagan's policies because for the time, with this incredible spending, the people who were doing well did very well. And they didn't realize that one day you're going to have to pay the bill. Because, let's see, you cut taxes, the rich people are happy. You cut taxes, you increase spending in the military. The military and the military-related industries are very happy. So people think, la la, this is great, we have all this money. Eventually that bill comes, and it tends to be due on the 1st of each month. Well, it's going to be due on the 1st of the Bush administration, when Reagan leaves office. So he has to go back on his promise of read my lips, no new taxes. As I started to mention, most presidencies are followed by a change in political parties. That was not true when Ronald Reagan left office. Ronald Reagan was immensely popular. He was likable, he was very popular, and the economy at one level was roaring during his presidency. We already talked about how it was smoke and mirrors, that the debt is rising and rising and rising, but as long as you don't have to pay it back, it's not that big of a deal. So, who's going to follow him but his vice president? Because people hope the good times will continue, that the Wizard of Oz will keep on wizarding. The Democrats nominate Michael Dukakis to run against George Bush. And Michael Dukakis simply was a weak candidate, and George Bush won the presidency easily. He pledged no new tax. He promised to be a continuation of Ronald Reagan and Reagan's policies. So George Bush is actually president when the Soviet Union collapses and communism, as it was termed, disappears from that part of the world. Yes, we still have China, and we have Korea, and we have Cuba, but the big bad boy, the Soviet Union, is going to end. Gorbachev heralds a new age of freedom in Eastern Europe, but it was like letting the tiger out of the tank. What Mikhail Gorbachev did when he allowed for glasnost and perestroika was give people a taste of self-determination and of freedom. They wanted more and more and more. And because the Soviet Union was on their butts in terms of their economic system, because they couldn't do the guns and butter the United States could do. They couldn't use their tremendous military to stop the satellite nations around the Soviet Union as they tried to get more autonomy and break away. So, in June of 1989, free elections were held in Poland. For the first time ever, Stalin promised free election all the way back at Yalta. Well, yeah, he kept his promise. In 1989, 45 years later, or 44 years later, but nevertheless, so now we're going to have a freer Poland, and the same thing is going to be happening in the rest of the satellite nations, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the like. In 1989, there were protests at the Berlin Wall. Now, in the old days, those protests would have been met with water cannons and gunfire. Gorbachev allowed those protests to continue in East Germany. Well, that led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and I have to tell you something I never thought I'd see. I had tears in my eyes when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. But understand, it wasn't George Bush that caused the Berlin Wall. It wasn't Ronald Reagan that caused the Berlin Wall to come down. It was Harry Truman, Dwight David Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush. It was the policies the United States adopted towards the Soviet Union that showed that their system would fail. They simply ran out of money, and you cannot keep people from freedom and from wanting to engage in a higher quality of life and not think that eventually they're not going to rise up against the situation. Gorbachev is going to resign as head of the Supreme Soviet and the premier of the Soviet Union in 1991, and that will be the end of the Soviet Union as we know it. Other interesting things that happened while George Bush is president is we have a problem in Panama. If you remember, Jimmy Carter had promised to give the Panama Canal back to the Panamanians, and he was to do that in 1999. So while this is going on, in this ensuing time period between the end of the Carter presidency and 1999, a little hijinks going on in Panama. There had a strong man, and that was the term used in the news, called Manuel Noriega, was dictator of Panama. He was called president, but he really wasn't a president. He seized power. And he's also thought to be a drug runner. And he was suppressing civil liberties, and George Bush invoked the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, and he invoked all kinds of ideas, basically said we have a right to go in and stop Manuel Noriega from being a jerk. So in something called Operation Just Cause, we invade Panama on December 20th, 1989. It lasts for about a month. And we're going to take Manuel Noriega out. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. The Marines land in Panama. We invade Panama. We secure the Panama Canal Zone. And we want to get Manuel Noriega. Manuel Noriega can't stand up to the United States. So he goes and he hides. And where does he hide? He hides in the Vatican Embassy in Panama. And the United States is not going to attack the Vatican Embassy. So instead, what we do is we play a mixture of Sesame Street tunes and heavy metal tunes, blaring them at the Vatican Embassy with lights on 24 hours a day. And eventually, the Vatican says, oh, no. And Manuel Noriega can't take this anymore. It's craziness. He runs out holding his head, and he's arrested. And to this day, in 2014, he is in a jail in Florida. Now, the funny thing about this is, this sounds kind of funny and silly that we invaded Panama and took out Manuel Noriega. It's a real debate whether it's legal or not. We invaded a sovereign nation, and we took out their leader. Was he a bad guy? He certainly was a bad guy. He certainly deserved to be taken out. But does the United States have that ultimate right to do that? According to the Roosevelt Corollary, yes, we do. But remember, we said that. Our President, Theodore Roosevelt, said we had that right. It doesn't mean we actually did. But of course, we tried the same thing in Cuba with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we did it. And it's interesting because an interesting parallel to this, someone pointed out to me recently, is the invasion of Putin's army Vladimir Putin's army into the Crimea. To seize the Crimea and bring it back into the Russian sphere is not terribly different. He looked at a threat on his border and said, I have to do something about it. It's worthy of a discussion. I don't know exactly how I feel about that one. I just wanted to point out that someone pointed that one out to me. Then we have the high water mark of the Bush presidency and his popularity skyrocketed. Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. Kuwait is just to the south of Iraq, and wanted their oil reserves and wanted their coastline. He said Kuwait was historically part of Iraq and that it had become a sovereign nation through the hijinks of European colonial powers and needed to be returned to Iraq. He actually wasn't completely wrong, but the way he did this and seizing Kuwait was looked at as a power grab by a Middle Eastern madman. And the United States and the United Nations said we're not going to allow this to occur. So starting in the summer of 1990, the United States launches a bombardment, an air bombardment of Iraq and Iraqi installations in Kuwait called Desert Shield. And while this is going on, the United States, with help from other United Nations troops, prepares an invasion of Kuwait to throw Saddam Hussein's troops, the Republican Guard, out of Kuwait and back into Iraq. So, move along. in January of 1981, December and January of 1981, we launched something called Desert Storm, which is the invasion to throw out the troops, to throw out the Republican Guard, and it was incredibly successful. It was incredibly successful, and we made Saddam Hussein look incredibly weak, and we made his incredibly strong military look very weak as well. And it was a huge success, and George Bush's popularity skyrocketed. You would think he would have been re-elected, and it would have just been over for the Democrats. Didn't go that way. Because in the back of people's mind, once that operation was over, once Desert Storm was over, they remembered 3 words that he said again and again and again. Just like when Obamacare was rolled out, people remember that President Obama saying, "You can keep your doctor." Well, George Bush said, "Read my lips." And that's him saying that. And this YouTube link will show him saying that. He said, "Read my lips. No new taxes." Except he had to raise taxes. He had to raise taxes because of what happened during the Reagan administration and the incredible spending. We had this tremendous debt and deficit that was out of control. And because it was so out of control, he had to do something about it. And he was brave. I have to hand it to George Bush. He went back on his campaign promise, but he knew the economy needed it, and he raised taxes. Well, that would be the end of George Bush, because when the 1992 election came around, there were 3 candidates: George Bush, Bill Clinton, and a guy by the name of Ross Perot, a third-party candidate. Well, Ross Perot took some Republican votes away from George Bush, and Bill Clinton sails into the White House because of that promise that George Bush went back on. So, this man could not defeat George Bush in 1988, but a promise of "read my lips" defeated him in 1992, and that was the end of George Bush the first. So it was an interesting time, those 12 years of the Reagan-Bush era. The United States had gained some international respect again as Ronald Reagan built up the military. It truly had been morning in America for some. It was a nightmare for others during those years as the social programs were cut way back. I remember the cuts to education were devastating, which is why today, when we look at the Reagan era, he's got a whole era. The only other president that has something like that is the age of Jackson. So it's the Reagan era now. When you look back at the Reagan era, it's a very mixed one. And the rose-colored glasses need to come off. Wonderful man, nice guy, restores some respect for America in the world. However, his economics were nonsense. Trickle-down economics does not work. If you increase funding to the wealthy, or you cut taxes to the wealthy, which is what happens when they get increased funding when you cut taxes, there's no guarantee they are going to trickle down that money. There's no guarantee they are going to hire people. And if you do that, by cutting taxes, you're cutting money for federal programs, which means you're going to have to lay people off, which means unemployment is going to increase. It didn't work to get us out of the Great Depression, which is why Herbert Hoover wasn't reelected, and it really didn't work during the Reagan years. Although there are people who still espouse supply-side economics today. Anyway, you can take a look at this on the Bush History website, www.bushhistory.net. Everything is there. Take a look at the folder. It's topic 28. It's the Reagan-Bush era. So, for now, I'm David Bush, and have a great day.